Hello, everybody. This is Bill Hoffman, Hoffy, and welcome to my Zoom lecture on architectural styles. Ever since I got my master's at UCLA and I looked at historic districts, I think it's really fun to look at buildings from different eras. There are so many architectural styles in the US we've borrowed from all over the world and we've created our own. So I've spent, kind of embarrassed to say this, maybe the last 40 years looking at buildings when I travel around. So I've put together a lecture on different architectural styles, about 35 of them. So when you drive around and you look at a building, you can say, hey, that's a Georgian revival. And that's probably 100 years old. So let me share my screen and I hope you enjoy this. You can follow along with the outline that I sent. And here we go. Okay, one more silly comment about buildings. A lot of people are bird watchers. I think birds are pretty cool, but unfortunately birds fly away, but buildings don't unless they get torn down. So you can become a building watcher if you're not already. So here's my PowerPoint on architectural styles, a guide to colonial styles up to 1820, romantic houses from 1820 to 1880. Those that still exist are quite ornate. Victorian houses up to 1900 are beautifully ornate. And then period revival styles from 1880 to 1940. And then modernism, postmodernism, and new modernism. So there's a lot to see, and let's check it out. Okay, first of all, as we look at buildings, I want you to be aware some buildings do not match a certain style. The architect decided to add elements of different styles and they're hard to classify. But I want to give you some general rules of thumb. First of all, the English put emphasis on the door. They often put pediments above the door, a fan light, or pilasters, which are embedded columns. The Italians were famous for the rounded window arch, and the French are famous for the steeply pitched mansard roof. So think doors for the English, windows for the Italians, and steep roof for the French. Okay, and this might help you a little bit. We're going to look at a lot of different types of roofs. A gable roof is like an upside down V. That's very common. A gambrel roof is a double pitched roof. You can see it's at the top low pitched and then steeper, sort of like a Dutch hat. A hipped roof comes up at an angle and then it meets a ridge. A stepped gable comes up to the building in a series of, looks like a ladder or steps. A shed roof is one angle from the top. A mansard roof is the French roof with the steeply pitched. And a parapet is an extension of a wall that covers the roof. So maybe that helps a little bit, but it's actually more fun to look at the different styles. So first of all, we have the early English colonial. Those buildings had small casement windows. They had very small window panes because they didn't have the technology to build large glass. They had very steeply pitched roofs because one reason was so they wouldn't gather snow. And they had horizontal wood siding for the most part, sometimes stone. Some of these also had a salt box. You can see the building on the left. From the top of the roof, you can see that it goes down at one continuous angle. So that's what they call the early English colonial or medieval style. The Dutch colonial has the gambrel roof that I talked about. It at the top, it's less of a steep angle, and then towards the bottom, it comes at a steeper angle. That's a double pitched roof, and sometimes it flares at the end. You might remember the Van de Kamp bakery hats that the bakers used to wear. The French colonial often had a very steeply pitched roof. And the colonial homes were made out of stone, the country homes. On the right-hand side, you can see the French influence in New Orleans. The balconies often wrapped all around the buildings because of the heat. So that was typical of urban areas as opposed to the country. They often had a gallery or a veranda that wrapped all the way around the building because of the heat. Spanish colonial is a very common style in the Southwest. It had thick adobe or plaster walls, a low pitched roof with red tiles, and usually it was asymmetrical. It wasn't a building that was formal looking. It could be anywhere from an adobe style home to a very beautiful, elaborate Spanish revival home. The second story balcony that you sometimes see in the Southwest is called a Monterey style because in Monterey, California, they built a second story balcony that was often cantilevered, which means it didn't have column supports, which the one does here in the bottom right. Spanish colonial, as I said, is a very diverse style. Here's some of the more beautiful missions. You can see the rounded mission gable in the church on the top left. You can see the arcaded or rounded arches were very common in Spanish colonial and mission buildings. And you can see a beautiful Carmel mission in Carmel, California on the bottom left. And you can see once again the arcaded look of Mission San Antonio in Central California. Spanish colonial is a beautiful style. The Georgian style you find mostly on the East Coast. This is a very bold and symmetrical style. It's often made of brick. It often has a hipped roof. Notice how the roof comes up at an angle and then it meets a ridge. It usually had a portico, or as the English like to do, they embellished the door with a fan light or columns. This one actually has a portico. So this is bold, beautiful, and symmetrical. This is a plantation in the Charleston area. Here's some more Georgian homes. You can see how symmetrical they are. And you can see how the front door always has some sort of adornment. The Georgian home in the bottom left is a gable roof. The one on the right-hand side, which is in Charleston, is a hipped roof, almost a pyramid roof. But you can see the doors are always embellished, which the English like to do. The federal style followed the Georgian style. It was a very formal style, very symmetrical again. And the facades of the buildings were actually a little bit boring. They did have a fan light above the door, typical of Georgian, but the change was they used Roman elements in their architecture. As you know, the Romans developed the rounded arch or the dome, which the Greeks did not. So the picture on the bottom left is the Oval Office in the White House. So inside a federal style home, you will often see the domes and lots of classical embellishments that you will typically not find in Georgian homes. So it was the Roman influence with the dome that made the federal style quite interesting. And taking it a step further is Thomas Jefferson's Jeffersonian classicism, or often called Roman Revival. This is the University of Virginia, and it's absolutely beautiful. You can see the dome again. That's the key feature of Roman Revival buildings. This one has a very large portico, which is the classical porch-like structure in the building with the pediment, the triangle at the top of the building. But this was Jefferson's Jeffersonian classicism. He loved the Roman influences. As they did more discoveries in Rome and Pompeii and Vesuvius, they found these rounded forms. You can also see the dome in Monticello, which is Jefferson's home in near Charlottesville, Virginia. You can also see the little fence at the top, which is called a balustrade. And you can see in the picture on the bottom right, you can see the dome in the back. That looks a lot like the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., and for a good reason. That was designed by a Pope, the same architect that did the Jefferson Memorial in D.C. This picture that I have in the bottom right is at the Huntington Library in Pasadena, San Marino. The Greek Revival buildings did not feature the dome, but they were considered a wonderful building for early America because we admired democracy and we admired the Greeks for one of the first cultures that really had a functioning democracy. Greek Revival buildings could be large temples, or they could be simple homes or churches with nothing but some columns and a pediment, the triangular element that the columns hold up. Usually Greek Revival buildings were white, and they typically had a gable roof. Here's some more Greek Revival buildings, quite dramatic. The one on the right shows a more colorful interpretation. I understood that the actual Greek temples were quite colorful, although the way they were interpreted in America was usually white, as the building is on the left. You can see those fluted Doric columns, this portico that stands out from this Greek Revival building in New Orleans. Another style that was very popular in the early 1800s was the early Gothic Revival. This is called Carpenter Gothic because it had so much woodwork. Remember, the Gothic Revival buildings usually had a pointed arch, and they had steeply pitched roofs. This particular style, called Carpenter Gothic, had the decorative gable trim. Right under the gable, you can see the decorative trim called verge boards. Now, sometimes Gothic Revival got very medieval looking. You can see in this is the University of Loyola in Chicago, and you can see that the windows are pointed, the pointed arch being the number one characteristic element of Gothic Revival. And this one also has the castellations or battlements, where you could almost picture an archer that would stand between with the bow and arrow or the crossbow. So this is a very classic early Gothic Revival building. This is kind of a transition building. This is late Romanesque, early Gothic. The Romanesque style in northern France had a lot of stone and a rounded arch, but they also had battlements. So you can see this building in the very middle in the back has these medieval battlements that are typical of Gothic. And it has some pointed arches, but it also has some rounded arches. So this is what I would refer to as a transition building between Romanesque and Gothic architecture. The Italianate style was very, very popular in the United States from around 1840 to around 1880. These buildings were very squarish, and they typically had the rounded arch, a rounded window arch of the Italian architecture. Notice they also had a cornice at the top of the building, which would stick out, and under the cornice was decorative brackets and also something called dentils. But you can see it's a formal looking, highly decorated, rounded windows with a bracket and a cornice at the top. And you can see these all over main streets on the East Coast, in the Midwest, and even in the West in the mid 1800s. There were also other romantic homes built in the 1880s. This is an octagon home. Obviously, it has 8 sides, and it has a cupola, which is a window tower or a bell tower in the middle of the building. I have been in very few octagonal buildings, and they're fairly rare, but I found this one, so I wanted to photograph it because it was fun. Then from 1860 on, we had a lot of very romantic Victorian homes, and one was called French Second Empire. And the French style, once again, has the steeply pitched mansard roofs. So you can see in both of these buildings, if you look up at the roof line, they have a steeply pitched French style roof with dormer windows. If you remember the TV series The Munsters, they lived in a French Second Empire, kind of a scary looking wooden home. The building on the right is the Executive Office Building in Washington, D.C., classic French Second Empire. Here's another one. You can see that the steeply pitched French or mansard roof has dormer windows, and it's double pitched. So it's the roof line that makes this a French Second Empire. Also, there was another style in the late 1800s called the stick style. This was a very fanciful Victorian style with lots of woodwork, but what made it look what made it called stick style were the supporting elements that are exposed, the woodworking elements below the eaves. You can see below the tower on the gable on the left with the two chimneys, you can see the supporting woodworking, which are the stick style. You can also see the stick style in the first floor on the left-hand side. These stick style elements were often used for decoration, not actually for structural elements. You see the stick style more common on the East Coast. You can call them decorative trusses or wooden beams. That's the Point Fermin Lighthouse in San Pedro, California. Beautiful building, and it does have a cupola. The kind of Queen Anne that's the most famous on the West Coast is the Queen Anne Victorian. And what makes it Queen Anne is the corner turret. So you can see the rounded turret in both of these buildings, which is the Queen Anne signature. They have textured shingles. They're very asymmetrical. And look at the wood surfaces. Everything is decorated. You've got fish scale. You've got horizontal wood cladding. You've got fancy windows and decorative spindle work around the porches. And they were just beautiful and fun buildings. You would walk into these Victorian homes and you would walk into the parlor and then the living room. And they call these the painted ladies in the San Francisco area. The Victorians that don't have the corner turret are often called East Lake Victorian. They had very ornate wood surfaces, sometimes plaster, but they didn't have the corner rounded turret. Another very fanciful style was called Richardsonian Romanesque. Henry Hobson Richardson was a famous architect on the East Coast, and he liked the Romanesque style. So you can see buildings were made of stone. They had rounded arches and very small columns. They were often asymmetrical, although the Trinity Church on the left in Boston is actually symmetrical. They're very medieval. They have very steeply pitched roofs, and they're a heavy use of stone or masonry. You can see the red sandstone on the Santa Ana Courthouse on the right. Here's another beautiful example of the Richardsonian Romanesque. Look at the small columns and the rounded arches, and the heavy masonry above the arches. You know, the Romanesque style spread through Europe before Gothic, and they put very small windows in for a good reason. Because these buildings were made of stone, if they had too many windows, they would collapse because they didn't have steel to support them. This is Stanford University, by the way. Another fun style, this is mostly on the Midwest and the West Coast. This is called false front or Western false front. They tended to have a vertical facade with a flat top on the front of the building. And this is sort of a fake way to make the building look grander or bigger than it was. Often the false front facade with a little parapet or decorative element covered a pretty boring building, but it was a good look for a saloon or a hotel, often covering a gable roof. Then starting in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, we had revival styles. Architects would bring back styles that were common earlier in American history. And this is a English colonial revival. Look at the door emphasis, which is so typically English. Look at the dormer windows and the steep gable roof. Look at the sash windows with the shutters that are often attached. Look at the horizontal wood siding, which was typical of colonial buildings. So this is a great example of colonial revival, English colonial. Also, Tudor revival is very common starting in the about 1910 all the way to 1935. The Tudor style, once again, is English. It has steeply pitched roofs. They were made of brick or stucco. And one of the distinctive features was the half timbering. In the side of the walls, they embedded planks of wood and painted them a different color. You can even see they did have timbering in the garage in the back of this building. Another style that was very common in the late 1800s and early 1900s was Chateauesque or Norman. This was a northern French style. This is characterized by a very busy roofline, many vertical spires and turrets and chimneys, multiple dormer windows. These were usually very solid, like a castle. Think of it. Chateau means castle. They were made of stone, but sometimes brick, but usually stone. Very common in the late 1800s, a very dramatic and a style for the rich, by the way. This is kind of fun. In Los Angeles, a lot of architects brought back the Chateauesque or Norman style in the 1920s and 30s to make an apartment building look like a French castle. Maybe it would sell better. You can see the dormer windows, the steeply pitched French roof, which is so typical, and the busy roof line. Some of those chimneys might just be decorative elements. We also have the Beaux-Arts style, which was very common. The Beaux-Arts style was the early 1900s. This was a style that architects in the United States learned when they went to France to study architecture. They brought back the classical elements to buildings again. So the Beaux-Arts architecture had lots of statuary, lots of coupled columns, a very fancy monumental classical elements, usually large staircases. Train stations would often be classical Beaux-Arts style. You can see in the top left, the statuary. This is the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. On the right is Grand Central Station in New York. Look at the statuary. The Denver train station on the left and the DC train station. Large courthouses, libraries, museums, train stations would often be Beaux-Arts style. And French, remember we talked about the French eclectic, where once again, these were homes in the suburban areas, lots of stone, and the steeply pitched roof line. And it's interesting that that roof line often enclosed an attic or a room that obviously didn't have very much of a flat ceiling with that steeply pitched roof. The Italian Renaissance style was brought back in the 1920s. This is a very squarish and formal building, like the early Renaissance buildings in Florence that were first designed in the late 1400s. You can see the cornice sticks out from the building. It's a low-pitched roof, and it's quite symmetrical. This is the building in Pasadena, the Wrigley Mansion, headquarters of the Tournament of Roses. The Romanesque revival, we talked about that before with the small columns and the rounded arches. This was a very popular style in many, many cities prior to 1930. Once again, they were made out of stone. They had rounded arches and small columns. You can see by the way, this is USC on the right and UCLA on the left. This was a very common style for academic architecture. Another style that I really like is the Mission Revival style that was popular from about 1910 to 1935. This was a Spanish style, thick walled, plaster whitish building with a rounded parapet or dormer at the top. Excuse me, not a dormer, but the dormer roof at the top. So you can see in the packing house, you can see the rounded dormer wall or the roof parapet. That's the distinguishing element of the Mission Revival style, which most of the missions had. This style was very popular for train stations. Look at the rounded parapet or dormer in these two train stations as you move up the coast in California. Also, Spanish colonial was very popular since the Spanish entered California in about 1769. This Spanish colonial revival was a very popular style for large-scale courthouses and also for large domestic homes. Thick adobe walls, thick plaster walls, and lots of different window embellishments. And they were asymmetrical. Here's a beautiful hotel designed by Julia Morgan, who also designed Hearst Castle. You can see once again the arcades, the rounded arches, which was typical in Spanish colonial homes and hotels. A beautiful example of this style. Sometimes the Spanish colonial revival could be quite small. Here's some beautiful single story Spanish colonial revival homes. Notice the thick plaster walls. Notice that they're asymmetrical and they have low pitched red tile roofs. The Monterey style, as I said, is like a Spanish colonial with a second story balcony. The one on the bottom left is the best example. They call it Monterey style because it originated in Monterey, California. Um, you can see on the top left, you can see the second story balcony, but this home actually has sort of a Greek revival pediment with columns um, that are supporting this balcony. The one on the right is more like an adobe to which a second story balcony has been added. Oh, I like rustic architecture. You find these in our national parks. These are often made of stone. They are asymmetrical and they depend on whatever national park you're visiting. The rustic architecture on the left is in the Grand Canyon National Park, and also on the bottom right, you can see that this is Hopi and Navajo and Pueblo style architecture because of the projecting wood logs called vigas. The the hotel on the top right is the Ahwahnee Hotel in Yosemite National Park, obviously made out of stone, reflecting the beautiful granite that is found in Yosemite. Gorgeous rustic architecture. Here's the Pueblo revival that I was talking about. The projecting vigas are supporting elements of the roof, and these are found throughout New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, California, and some in southern Nevada. Sometimes the revival styles get quite exotic. This is Assyrian or Babylonian revival. This has got some Art Deco elements with a vertical emphasis and the decoration on the walls, but this looks very much like a ziggurat you would find in Babylonia or early Mesopotamia. As the building got taller, it got narrower. Also, the building on the left is the Chinese Theater in Hollywood, the most famous theater. This could be called Asian Revival. On the bottom, on the right-hand side, we have Egyptian Revival. With the discovery of King Tut's tomb, people wanted to be buried in a Egyptian sarcophagus. The thick columns of the Egyptians were copied here in many of the cemeteries in Los Angeles and Hollywood. This is a Indian revival. This is the Brand Library in Glendale. This is something you would find in India. I don't know much about the revival style, but I found it just drop dead gorgeous, built in the 1920s. This is in Monrovia, California. This is Aztec revival. The architect looked at the motifs that the Aztecs of central Mexico built and applied it to this hotel. So anything goes in the 1920s, especially in the Los Angeles area. A very famous architectural style in the early 1900s in Southern California was Craftsman bungalows, made famous by the Green and Green brothers in Pasadena. They built a beautiful Gamble house featuring a rejection of machine age technology, but a celebration of woodworking and craftsmanship. Inside, they designed all the furniture and the lamps and the rugs. Many of the Craftsman buildings had exposed rafters that were often decorated. They had the beautiful Arroyo stone lamps that decorated the buildings. You can see on the bottom right, the beautiful decoration, the leaded window of the front door. In the upper right, you can see what they call an airplane bungalow, a second story, a gabled roof. Most of the Craftsmen had beautiful porches and lots of woodwork. Some of them were quite simple. They were built from contractor books. sometimes from Sears and Roebuck, or they could be the high style craftsman examples of the Green and Green brothers. Another style that was very popular in the early 1900s was the prairie style. This was made famous by Frank Lloyd Wright. This is the Robie House at University of Chicago. Very modern looking building for the 19 teens. You can see the emphasis is on projecting geometric forms. The eaves of the roofs go way beyond the walls. You can also see that the windows are clustered at the top of the walls. Those are called clerestory windows. So the emphasis here is on the horizontal, since after all, the Chicago area is quite flat. And Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to recognize that. The Oak Park neighborhood also has lots of Frank Lloyd Wright prairie style building with his distinctive geometric detailing. There was another fun type of architecture in the early 1920s called programmatic architecture. These were buildings meant to represent the products that they sold, and they were part of the automobile age, especially in the Los Angeles area. So if you want a donut, you go to Randy's Donuts. You could see the donut from your car. The camera building on the right is a good example of where they sell cameras. The Brown Derby, there's the Derby off of Wilshire Boulevard. And of course, the Tamale building, one of the classic programmatic buildings. They're a lot of fun. Can you imagine Sphinx Retail Company? Starting at about 1920, the modern movement from Germany, the Bauhaus, the less is more philosophy, started to become very, very popular in the United States, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. And these type of styles were flat roofs. They didn't have any decorative detailing. They often grouped the windows together. They were often smooth white walls. Form follows function. This is the Schindler designed home in Newport Beach. And then very popular was the Art Deco movement in the roaring 20s and the early 30s. The Art Deco buildings, the large commercial buildings, got narrower as they grew taller. The windows were recessed. You can see that the windows have a real vertical emphasis. And if you look closely at the building, you can see lots of ornamentation, which is what Art Deco means. That's what the whole original international conference of artists and architects in Paris, that's what they wanted to do, decorate furniture and lobbies and buildings. Interestingly, in the United States, architects decorated the outside of buildings, even though you couldn't really see the tops of the buildings from the ground level. Think of the Empire State Building. How in the heck could you see those details from hundreds and hundreds of feet below? But one thing is absolutely beautiful is the tremendous detailing of the Art Deco period, decorating walls and windows and lobbies and the gables and even toasters. So it's really fun to go inside an Art Deco building up close and look at the tremendous Art Deco detailing. Long Beach, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, almost any large city has some beautiful Art Deco buildings, many of which have been preserved. Schools, by the way, often were built in the late 20s and 30s and have some beautiful Art Deco detailing. Closely aligned to the Art Deco movement is the streamlined modern style. This was a celebration of transportation. The building was meant to look like a boat or a ship or an airplane with a rounded wind tunnel look, often with glass brick, very streamlined. And they often had Art Deco mosaics or detailing inside. Diners often used the streamlined modern look. It was a little less ornate than Art Deco, but it was very fanciful. Very popular then, from 1935 on, was the California Ranch House. This was an asymmetrical, low-lying building in the suburbs. It's sort of like the Brady Bunch house. The walls often had various surface detailing, and it had low-pitched roofs. You see ranch houses built from 1935 all the way to the 1960s. California, Lakewood, all over California, you find these ranch houses. Starting with the late 40s up until the mid 60s, we had a look called the mid-century modern. This was incorporating the modernist movement, rejecting Tudor revival or Chateauesque or any of these historical revivals, but to make a building that had very clean lines. There's a lot of mid-century modern in Palm Springs. You had flat roofs or low-pitched butterfly roofs. You had wall-to-ceiling glass. You had a beautiful indoor-outdoor flow, clean geometric lines that often had a breezeway. The Eichler homes and the Alexander homes were very popular mid-century modern homes. I would say that Palm Springs has the greatest concentration of these beautiful mid-century modern homes. The modern movement was called the international style when it was applied to skyscrapers, because all over the world, these skyscrapers looked the same. So in the 1930s, they said, wait, these buildings are international. They look the same all over the world. On the left is the famous Lever House in Washington, D.C. Because of the great technology, it's called a glass curtain wall. Steel is so strong that it holds up the entire wall. So that's why they call it a glass curtain wall. And the architectural tour of Chicago, the greatest architecture tour in the US, you can see these beautiful international style buildings. And you'll see many of them, of course, in New York City. It's fun to look at the evolution of skyscrapers throughout time. In the early 1880s, you can see that the skyscrapers look like columns, because after all, it was classical revival. And then in the early 1900s, skyscrapers looked like cathedrals of commerce, because the owners of these buildings, like the Woolworth building in New York, wanted to sell a product. So they wanted their building to make a statement. And then the skyscrapers of the early 1930s or late 20s were Art Deco. They got narrower as they got taller, because that was the style then. And then starting in 1950s, we had the modernism. The skyscrapers were very plain. They had a flat top. They were pure geometric forms. Form follows function. I think they were rather boring, but they certainly can be considered elegant for their time. Then in 1970 on, we had expressive modernism, where architects are starting to play with the box. They're starting to change the shape. They're adding elements, but they're still using modern materials. A good example of that is the Transamerica building, designed by William Pereira in San Francisco. Then starting in 1990 on, we have new modernism, which sometimes it incorporates playful elements with modern materials. Sometimes it's a new type of glass that's energy efficient. So we can call from 1990 on new modernism. And this was a style that wasn't particularly good looking. In the 1960s, the excess use of concrete was called brutalism. So I hate to say it, but there's not a lot of good looking buildings from the 1960s. So architects call this brutalism. Unpainted concrete, often prisons, large public buildings. This is a public library in Boston, a great example of brutalism. That is an ugly building, but once again, it's a product of its time. Postmodernism was kind of fun. It started in the early 1980s. The architects got tired of less is more, or form follows function. So they started to use historical symbols or playful references in their buildings, but they were still with modern materials. So if you take a look at the building on the left, it's a university building with a rounded broken pediment, which is kind of a Renaissance style, but the modern materials make it postmodern. On the bottom right is a famous library in San Juan Capistrano. It's kind of Spanish colonial, it's kind of Mayan, it's kind of Aztec, but the windows are kind of modern. It's very playful. Let's call it postmodern. This is another postmodern building, This is the Portland building. It's decorated in lots of colorful ways. It almost looks like a large wrapped package. So this kind of playfulness and fun surface detailing is postmodernism. Another important element in style is called contextualism. Here the architect is trying to blend in the building to whatever is in the local region. This is called vernacular architecture, using the local specialty. This, by the way, is the Monterey Bay Aquarium. There are a lot of fish in here, but it's made to look like a cannery. And the canneries were, of course, built in the Monterey area starting in the 1800s. So this is a beautiful example of the contextual design used in the 1980s. This is an example of late modernism. Here the architect is certainly not imitating history, but he's using some beautiful materials. In this case, a form of limestone and marble to decorate the building, but the lines are very geometric. So we can call this late modernism. Richard Meyer, this is the Getty Center, one of the most beautiful late modern buildings that I know of. And then we have, starting in the 2000s, some very fanciful designs. There's really no way to describe this. You could say that this building is coming apart. Some people call it deconstructivism, which was actually popular in Russia back in the 1900s. I like to call this lyrical modernism because the building is almost singing or flying with its stainless steel. And this is a concert hall, by the way. So lots of fun new buildings coming up in the 21st century. Some people call this deconstructivism. The building seems to come apart, but it's also high-tech, sustainable buildings. On the bottom right, these window panes, they actually rotate to capture more sun and ventilation. These are very energy efficient buildings. This is a good example of sustainable architecture. Renzo's Pianos, California Academy of Science, with its famous green roof for ventilation. I like some of this new sustainable architecture. I like the architecture in the Claremont colleges. These buildings have lots of energy efficient glass, which allows enough sunlight in to warm the building when necessary. And they have enough reflective material to repel the sun at the right times of day. Some great new architecture. And some of the new towers that are going up now have lots of balconies, and they're no longer as boring as they were in the 1950s and 60s. They have well-articulated surfaces, which are lots of fun. And I love the Aqua Tower. This is sort of, I'm calling this organic modernism. The building seems to come alive with these balconies. This is a skyscraper found in Chicago. And then in Culver City, they're doing some very interesting new modern architecture. Look at the building on the upper left, that's definitely breaking apart. That's called deconstructivism. And then we have some very interesting towers. One of the ones is a restaurant on the right-hand side. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed looking at different architectural styles. And just for fun, folks, I know I covered a lot, but hey, you can go back and watch this, and you can also use my handout as a guide. So let's take a look at some buildings and see if you remember a few of the styles that I taught you. So I'm going to show the building and then give the answer. So what style would this be? Look at the steeply pitched roofs. What culture emphasized these steeply pitched roofs? This is French Second Empire. Very good. And how about this particular one? Look at the rounded arch and the small columns and the heavy use of stone with very few windows. This is Romanesque architecture. And now how about number 3? This is the Natural History Museum in San Diego. Notice how I said lots of statuary, monumental classical revival, early 1900s. This is Beaux-Arts style. This is actually the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. And look at these stucco surfaces and look on both sides of the tower. Look at the rounded parapets at the top and look at the tower at the top. What does that remind you of? That's actually Mission Revival, sitting right on Waikiki Beach, by the way. How about number 5? This is the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. Take a look at the rounded dome and then the classical portico. This isn't quite Greek revival, is it? It's Roman revival or Jeffersonian classicism. Look at number 6. Now, this is a very symmetrical building made out of brick, and you'll notice that there's door emphasis. What do you think this one is? This one has a gable roof, but if you look at the front doors, this would be a good example of Georgian revival, symmetrical and bold and made out of brick. Okay, number 7 is a library. Look at that unpainted concrete or cement. What do you think, folks? This is definitely brutalism. I had to throw one in. Quiz number 8. What do you think? This is a building built probably in the 1990s. Look at the, it almost looks like a Mission rounded gable in the entry, but it's very modern material. So what do you call a style of architecture which is playful, modern, but also hints at history? That would be postmodern. Okay, this is actually from Beaufort, South Carolina. Look at the pointed arched windows and the battlements at the top. This building is from the early 1800s. This is Gothic revival. Oh, what a fanciful building this is. Look at the woodwork. Look at the cupola. Look at the turret on the side. Look at the fancy spindle work around the porches. This is probably 1890 or so. This is definitely Victorian. I would go as far as to say this is Queen Anne Victorian because of the corner turret. What a building. And you don't see too many Queen Anne Victorians next to palm trees, but you do in Southern California. Number 11, look at how this building gets narrower as it gets taller. Look at the statuary. Look at the decoration of this building around the entrance of the building. This is definitely Art Deco. It could also be called Art Moderne. Look at this building. Remember I said these buildings were very popular. They usually had the rounded window and they had the projecting bracket, very common. And I remember we said that a certain European culture emphasized the rounded the rounded windows and the symmetrical look. That is Italianate. And finally, look at this building. This is in the Garden District in New Orleans. Look once again at the projecting brackets at the top and the cornice. Look at how the windows are rounded and the building is rather squarish. This is again Italianate, but with a little bit of a New Orleans flair with the projecting balconies made of metal and the grill work. So this is a good example of a regional interpretation of Italianate architecture. And how about number 14? Number 14 is kind of an elegant building. Look at the horizontal emphasis. There's no historical references here. This would definitely be modernism. This is the Water and Power Building. This is a good example of early 1960s modernist architecture in Los Angeles. Okay, I hope you enjoyed my slideshow. We really looked at a lot of styles. Let's see if I can get you back to me. I'm going to stop the share. So anyway, thank you very much, everybody. So remember, when you're driving around, maybe you can use my guide. I recommend the book by Virginia McAllister, A Guide to American Houses. But it's fun to look at buildings because we have borrowed and borrowed and borrowed. And remember, architecture is to be enjoyed. It's functional art. So I hope you enjoyed architectural styles. Thank you so much for joining my lecture. Bye-bye, everybody.